So the focus switches from defending that calorie deficit to nutritional adequacy, actually making sure that patients are getting enough calories, enough protein, enough fiber.
Hello and welcome to the Scale Up Your Practice podcast brought to you by Obesity Canada. I'm Dr. Roshan Abraham, family physician and associate professor at the University of Alberta.
And I'm Michelle McMillan, a lived experience advocate with Obesity Canada.
For decades, dietary advice in healthcare has been reduced to one phrase: eat less and move more. We treated nutrition as a math equation and body weight as a measure of willpower. Today, the science of obesity has evolved and our approach to nutrition must evolve with it. We're moving away from blame-focused calorie restriction and toward highly personalized medical nutrition therapy, ensuring our patients are nourished, supported, and heard.
Today's episode is supported by an unrestricted educational grant from Eli Lilly Canada. We thank them for helping us bring this podcast to clinicians across the country. Today, we are focusing on medical nutrition therapy. Specifically, we want to look at how clinicians can work with patients to understand their nutritional needs and build care plans with their patients that feel realistic, respectful, collaborative, and individualized.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Michelle Cardel. Dr. Cardel is a registered dietitian and an obesity and nutrition scientist who has spent 20 years focused on developing evidence-based lifestyle strategies. She is also the co-director for the Center of Cardiovascular and Metabolic Disease at the University of Florida and a senior medical director at Kylera Therapeutics. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we wanted to get started with a question. Why is now such an important time to rethink our approach to nutrition?
With the advent of GLP-1s and increased utilization of GLP-1s, I think we're learning a lot of different things. One, we're seeing more acceptance that obesity is a chronic disease and deserves long-term care and treatment. And simply telling patients to eat less and move more is not just incorrect, but actually doing much more damage than it is good. And with the advent of GLP-1s and increased utilization of those medications, we really need to take a very different approach to nutrition and lifestyle than we did when we were thinking about standard behavioral weight management alone.
Yeah, it's a brave new world out there, right? There's been a fundamental shift in things. I'd be interested because I know that you've been in this field a long time. I'd be interested to know what brought you to this field and why you've stayed in this field for, I believe, over 20 years at this point.
Yes. I actually thought I wanted to be a physician. And when I was in undergrad, I did 3 medical mission trips, really positive experiences, and also showed me that that probably wasn't the right route for me. And so I basically graduated college not really knowing what my next step was going to be. But I had started being a hospice volunteer when I was in undergraduate. And being part of that experience was a real privilege. I got to be a hospice volunteer for about 10 years total. But it's a real privilege to be with people at the end of life. And oftentimes you see that people want to share and they want to talk about their memories and the best things that happened in their life, but also some things that they regretted. And during that time, some patients that I was lucky enough to work with shared how they felt that their lifestyle and in particular nutrition may have played a role in their disease risk and ultimately what led to their terminal disease that put them in hospice. And, I was 19 years old when I started in hospice. I was not thinking about how nutrition or lifestyle would impact, quality of life or, how we live or even how we die, decades later. And those conversations really prompted my interest in nutrition. And I started a master's in nutrition, never having taken a single nutrition course. But in that first class, I knew I had found my thing. I had never had that feeling before. And so I ended up doing the master's in clinical nutrition, the PhD in nutrition sciences. And about halfway through my PhD, I said, I still want that clinical side. That's really important to me. And that's when I did the registered dietitian training as well.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So obviously your interest came from a very, human based, caring for people place. You've said a little bit about it, but, you know, if we expand on that a little, what did the experience teach you about the role food and nutrition can play in the overall quality of life?
We know from the data that nutrition can play a significant role in a variety of aspects of our life in terms of physical health, mental health. It has, connections with social health, emotional health, all these things. I mean, food is such a central part of who we are as humans. It's how we show love, it's how we connect with others, it's how we grieve. And the fact that it's so integral to every part of the human experience is such a beautiful part, and it's such a privilege to be part of this field.
Really love hearing that. Um, for a long time, when we talk about obesity, medicine, and science, the systemic message from healthcare professionals was to limit intake, leaving patients to constantly push back against their own biology. Now, just as you mentioned, with treatments that regulate appetite, how does the clinician's role really shift to supportive eating patterns?
There is a fundamental shift. Before, what we did with standard behavioral weight management is thinking about managing those external factors that drive eating behavior, whether it is emotional eating, stress, alcohol. We often would prescribe self monitoring as a way to, really all of this was in service of defending that calorie deficit. But now with GLP-1 medications, we have treatment that actually addresses the biological drivers of obesity. So the focus switches from defending that calorie deficit to nutritional adequacy, actually making sure that patients are getting enough calories, enough protein, enough fiber, that they're hydrating enough, that they're prioritizing physical activity and resistance training, prioritizing that restorative sleep and that stress management, and really thinks about things in a much more holistic perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of the pieces that, we're still coping with a little bit with the new
Yeah.
treatments. I mean, I can speak from my personal experience. I've been around this planet a little while, and I've lived in the eat less, move more culture for much longer than the current culture around obesity being a chronic disease, driven by biology. And I know when I started treatment, because I had always been told eat less, move more. I'm like, this is perfect. I'm not hungry. I don't have to eat, which was great until they did some blood work and I didn't feel so hot. And it was like, oh, you're deficient in, oh, here's 6 things that you're deficient in, right? So I'd be curious, how do you address with your patients, that misconception of they've always been told just eat less, move more, and they're now like, I can eat less, and now you're telling me that I should actually eat stuff? Like this is a difficult message for you to get to the people that you work with, is it not?
It's a really hard thing for people to reconcile. I think your experience is quite representative of what many people have experienced. And it is a shift. And it's funny. I have talked with patients and they're like, Michelle, it's amazing. I won't even think about food till 4 o'clock. And it's like, ooh, that's actually not the goal. What's amazing about these medications is that it quiets the food noise. And this is an opportunity to help develop and sustain those healthy habits that you've likely been working on your whole life. And now the medications are addressing the biology, and that helps facilitate the behaviors that you've already been working on for so long, for so hard, and helping people shift their mindset into how they think about food. Food, oftentimes, from what I've heard from patients, and Michelle, I'd love to hear your take on this, is that food was almost the enemy in a sense. It was something that was always trying to be controlled and minimized as much as possible. And the freedom that these medications give and the improvements in the relationship with food, when for the first time in your life, you're not trying to stay under a ceiling of calories or points or whatever the designation was, grams. For the first time, we're actually shifting to minimum targets. And that's what I talk a lot about with patients. This is the minimum amount of calories I want you to eat. This is the minimum amount of grams of protein or fiber or, liters of water or whatever it is. And once people see that shift, they're like, oh, it is way more fun to go track towards a minimum than it is towards a maximum.
Yeah, you're speaking, the truth that I feel, I've felt and I've experienced. Yeah. If you've spent your whole life fighting biology to always be under something, whatever that under is, to suddenly shift that thought to, okay, you need to eat at least this much protein. You have to make sure that you're getting at least, this much fluid in your body. Like, I think it's easier, but it does take a mind shift, right? Because for the longest time it's been the other way. So yeah, I think that's important for, our listeners, particularly clinicians, to appreciate that you're probably going to have to wait till that moment in your office where you see that change, like the flipping of the chart in the mind, as I would say, right? That point where they go, oh,
Yeah. And I do see also needing to do some re-education around what nutritional adequacy and balance looks like, particularly where I see it the most is around carbohydrates. There tends to be a significant fear around carbohydrates and a belief that even on a GLP-1, carbohydrates need to continue to be restricted. And my personal take is that when you're on a medication that so
Mhm.
severely limits appetite, I personally, unless it's medically indicated or very important to the patient, in which case we always want to engage in patient-centered care and follow the patient. But in general, as a guideline, I would not recommend continuing on highly restricted diets in combination with a GLP-1 medication.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everything that you've just said. That is always in my mind as a family doctor. And even when we're combating weight bias and stigma, both from a patient perspective as well as from the medical establishment perspective, I do really think it's important for us to continue having these conversations and to advocate for this type of approach, if you will, that these are there to complement, these are part of a multidisciplinary approach to therapy, and that we need to see it as such. Um, there is a massive amount of stigma surrounding what people eat, especially for people with larger bodies or those living with obesity. It leads to shame, missed or delayed diagnoses, complicated relationships with food, as we've mentioned, or disordered eating behaviors. How does the systemic weight bias show up in standard dietary advice? And what can clinicians do to mitigate this when they're seeing patients?
First off, everything you said is so spot on. So I just want to acknowledge that. And also to say, I do think that there is a great deal of weight bias and stigma often related to dietary recommendations. I mean, even the simple premise of just eat less, move more is inherently stigmatizing. It's like asking somebody with asthma to just breathe better, or somebody living with depression to just cheer up. It's like, wow, like I've never thought of that before. I mean, it's truly almost insulting. Actually, it is insulting And I understand that not everybody understands the pathophysiology of obesity,
Mhm.
but we need to. This is why podcasts like yours are so important in the education around that and to highlight that this is biologically driven, this is genetically driven, and we need to bring the same empathetic and evidence based care and approach to the disease of obesity as we would any other chronic disease and condition.
I know that you've done a lot of work around the concept of food noise, and that's a concept that I personally use. I know there's lots of nomenclature out there about what people use to describe it. I call food noise those intrusive thoughts about food, right? From the moment you wake to the moment you sleep in the night, at every single point of the day, there's a little talking in your mind about things. So I'd be curious when you're dealing with patients, how does recognizing this as a real thing? Because for a lot of times, I think a lot of people like myself thought everyone is like this. I just can't control it, right? Um, so how do you explain that, that concept of food noise? And do you find it helps relieve some of the internalized blame that people have around those food noise thoughts?
Absolutely. What I have seen is when people are able to, for example, get on a medication where the food noise is reduced, it's very validating when they see, like, this wasn't a reflection of me or my willpower or my discipline. This was a real phenomena happening within my body. And now that it's reduced, it allows for all this additional time and cognitive effort to be redirected to other things. And it's very I've seen it be very liberating for people to have that food noise reduced, and also the realization that, holy moly, do other people walk around the world not experiencing this food noise all the time? Like, it's such a huge difference in the experience. And when I've heard people argue against food noise, that it's just a reflection of hunger. To me, that's telling me that they've never experienced food noise.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can honestly say it's real because I remember after starting treatment, and I just had one day where I realized, like partway through the day, that I hadn't thought about food. And I had this epiphany that I bet this is what people who don't live with obesity, I bet this is how their brain works all of the
Yeah.
time. It's a major epiphany. And it's weird because it's backwards, right? Only by developing the treatment did we realize that this was a real thing. It wasn't just, as we would say, in people's heads.
Yes, and it's been so I was fortunate to be part of the study team that developed the first scientifically validated food noise questionnaire. It's a 5-item questionnaire called the food noise questionnaire, and the what we're seeing in the data is almost a 50% reduction in food noise for people when they're put on a GLP-1 medication. I mean, it's life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah. 50%. Oh, I did not know that. I have to go review that paper. Is this from 2025?
Well, we haven't published it yet.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. I was just quickly looking something up because this is actually really exciting for me as a family doctor. I'm trying to find ways to bring this into our academic clinic practice with our residents and teaching them around sort of a multidisciplinary approach to obesity, and the food noise questionnaire had come up, but I didn't know if it again, it was just in my preliminary research. So that's something that we can all look forward to once it is fully published.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Before we get into what this looks like in day-to-day practice, like I'm jumping the gun right now, I want to share something that may be helpful for clinicians listening who are thinking, I want to do this better, but I need more tools. If you're looking to strengthen your approach to obesity care, I'd encourage you to check out Obesity Canada's Caliber course. It's an accredited course designed for healthcare professionals who want practical, evidence-based tools they can apply right away. Caliber includes a mix of self-paced learning and live interactive sessions, and the next cohort runs September 3rd through October 7th. You'll find the link in the show notes, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can scan the QR code on screen to learn more and register. So talking a bit about what it looks like in a busy clinical practice, if we need to collaborate with the patient to assess the role of nutrition interventions in their specific journey, how do we actually do that and create an individualized plan for them?
In an ideal world, you would be referring out to a nutrition professional, like a registered dietitian who can spend, 60 minutes meeting patients where they are, getting a full history, really understanding what drives their eating behavior, their socioeconomic status, what's accessible to them, what are their likes, dislikes, preferences, allergies, in order to create really personalized recommendations. However, that's also not always possible,
Mhm.
both within a clinical setting, but also from an accessibility standpoint. So I know that physicians and healthcare providers are always really limited on time. So
Mhm.
if you're able to not make assumptions about what
Mm.
anybody is eating, I would say start with that. Ask questions, approach it with curiosity. I think sometimes the assumption is that somebody living with obesity, A, doesn't know much about nutrition. In my experience, it's the exact opposite.
Opposite, yeah.
People living with obesity tend to know so much about nutrition. They can tell you the calories in every food, the grams of, every macronutrient. Obesity is not a reflection of a knowledge gap. So taking the time to understand what are the areas the patient is most interested in modifying or making changes to, understanding where they would like more support, particularly when you're in a time constrained session.
I actually had a follow-up question, and that was, what should clinicians be considering if a patient is starting or already taking an obesity medication? And I'm wondering specifically if there are things, if we're going to refer out to a registered dietitian, which in some parts of Canada, especially in Alberta, through the primary care networks, we do actually have access. All clinicians, all primary care providers who are affiliated with a primary care network do have access to a registered dietitian. What sort of things should they be including as part of that referral process?
If they're going to refer out, ideally you want to be referring out to a dietitian with expertise and experience in GLP-1s. It is a very different recommendation model than standard behavioral weight management. And if somebody is not able to refer out and you because of time constraints or whatever it is, need to provide a very quick and dirty recommendation, then what we would recommend is something that is called like the 30-30-30 rule. You want at least 30 grams of protein at each meal, 30 grams of fiber daily, and 30 minutes of physical activity each day, ideally with resistance training twice a week. And if you can throw some information in there about hydration, that would be a bonus because many people realize that GLP-1 suppress appetite, but they don't often realize that GLP-1 suppress thirst signaling. And so that's why
Right.
you'll often hear that somebody on a GLP-1, they'll have their coffee in the morning out of habit, and then they often forget to drink, anything besides that the rest of the day. And that can contribute to headaches, dizziness, fatigue, dehydration, etc.
I really like that 30-30-30 rule because that is something that a patient, it sticks in your
Yeah.
mind. You can walk away. And even if I don't take notes at the session, like specific notes, 30 of this, 30 of this, 30 of this, like that's enough that I can either remember what the 330s are or I can reference in our next appointment. Like I'd be like,
Mhm.
I remember the 30 grams of protein and the 30 minutes of exercise. What was the middle 30 again? And so it gives us a framework to start talking about things, and then it also gives a framework for clinicians to, okay, so you've got the 30-30-30 down, maybe can we talk a little bit about hydration, like you can slowly add other things in, and you're not, because what can sometimes happen, I speak as a patient, is you start feeling overwhelmed, like, there's so much information and I'm trying to take it all in, but I can't take it all in and I feel like I'm missing things. So yeah, I love that.
And I love how you talk about that, Michelle, that it can be a helpful starting point, and then after you integrate that into your lifestyle, then you build, on new habits from there.
Mhm.
So, for many people living with obesity, like myself, unfortunately, we carry a lot of history. We don't walk into your office. It's the first time you're meeting me, and it may be the first time I'm meeting you, but I've got 30 years of meeting health professionals that are history in my mind, good, bad, and otherwise, right? That you don't know about, but I'm living with. And unfortunately, around some of that history, there's some shame because we've been shamed and blamed. As I said, this is a new concept, that this is, a chronic disease driven by biology, right? There was a lot, even in the medical community, about, it's kind of willpower and bad choices and, those kind of things. And so that kind of led to a little bit of frustration, right, from patients. We got a lot of advice that maybe wasn't very helpful about things. And sometimes, if people make assumptions about, that you don't know anything about nutrition, you're just dumb. If you just knew more about nutrition, you wouldn't be obese. So you tend to feel like you're not heard and you're not cared for. So, based on your work, maybe you could provide some advice, some direction, some experiences about how you deal with that with your patients, and, and how that, you've already talked about it being personalized. So how that flows from, you know, dealing with all the things that I just threw at you and then somehow working with that person as an individual human being that you have to work with as an individual. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Too many. But I before we go into the recommendation piece, I just want to share a story that I think it's really important for people to understand, because this is a story of my mom's best friend. They grew up together in Puerto Rico, and she lived with obesity, and she was having issues with her heart for years, and she kept going to healthcare providers and saying something is wrong, something feels wrong. And every healthcare provider she went to told her she just had to lose weight. She just needed to eat less, move more. Well, it turns out that she had a very serious heart condition that had absolutely nothing to do with her weight. And by the time they discovered it, it was quite late and the disease was quite severe, and she actually died on the operating table. And so all this to say is that weight bias and stigma literally kills. And checking in with ourselves as healthcare providers, doing something like the implicit association test, which is available free online to check in with yourself. Where do you stand on this? If you come out such that you are biased towards people living with obesity, that doesn't inherently make you a bad person. All it does is that it brings awareness to you to say, there's some work I need to do. Just like, you know, when new medications come out, you study those and you study how to prescribe them and you study what you need to share with the patients. It's very similar to that. And so on the weight bias piece, it affects everything we do as healthcare providers, the treatment options we provide, the time we spend with patients, how patients feel in our care. And there's data to support every single aspect of what I've just said. So first and foremost, I would say taking the time to check in with yourself and to have a real honest look and assessment, and take the time to learn, use the resources from places like Obesity Canada and Obesity Action Coalition to learn more how you can better support your patients.
So I guess one of my last questions, and we've asked this of a lot of our guests, is how does a compassionate, evidence-based, and in this case, approach to nutrition therapy change a patient's long-term relationship with food and their own body?
It can have such far reaching ramifications. if it's done well for the positive, if it's done poorly, it can be disastrous. So providing that empathetic, compassionate care, approaching things with curiosity, providing support and treatment and recommendations that can help facilitate improvements in eating pathology. For example, what we're seeing with GLP-1 medications in a clinical trial that we have published in 180 people living with obesity who were on either semaglutide or tirzepatide. We saw that over a 6-month period, there were significant improvements in disordered eating pathology, in overall well-being, in quality of life. And that's when it was provided with an evidence-based nutrition program. So the more that we can provide that empathetic, compassionate care and tools that are really tailored to the patient in front of you, not just considering medical history and age and sex or gender, but also thinking about being culturally appropriate, meeting them where they are in terms of the community they live in, the resources they have access to, and truly providing those recommendations. It's such an important piece.
Yeah. I mean, that's just so true that you
Yeah.
need to meet the patient where they are, and everyone is at a different place. And,
Yeah.
you know, some of your patients may be super well informed, and some of your patients may be new to this. And, you have to kind of find that out first, right? I mean, I think what I'd say to our clinician listeners is that, you have an opportunity when they come to see you face to face, because we're seeing a little bit of shift. There is a possibility they could get these medications without ever
Hmm.
sitting down with you and talking to you. So the mere fact that they've come in to see you, they've taken their time, you've taken your time, it really is an opportunity as a clinician to step in and say, I have an opportunity, because that person has chosen to be here, and they can probably get that med without being here. So it's a real opportunity to open that conversation. So such a great point that you raised. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, Michelle. You're so right of where people can access these medications now and who they're getting their information from. There was a study done that showed that nearly 50% of people learned about GLP-1 medications on social media, and only 19% learned about them from a healthcare provider. So there's a lot of great information. There's a lot of benefits of things like social media and the democratization of information, but it also allows for a lot of misinformation to be out there. So taking that time, like you said, to assess where is this patient currently and how can I best support can make all the difference.
This has been so good. I mean, there's so many little nuggets that you've put in that I hope our listeners will take away from
Yeah,
them,
I do
whether they're
too.
clinicians or not. Because I know that we have some listeners who are just patients, right? They're living with it, and yeah, that's amazing. Today we talked about how to collaborate with patients to create individual nutrition plans.
We also talked about why nutrition is important when prescribing obesity medications and how helping patients understand the biology behind hunger, fullness, and food noise can reduce shame and systemic weight bias.
You can find direct links to the Canadian Adult Obesity Clinical Practice Guidelines, Obesity Canada's education courses, as well as Dr. Cardel's research on food noise in our show notes. Please visit them to dig deeper into the evidence.
As a reminder, new episodes of Scale Up Your Practice drop every second Thursday, so make sure you are subscribed so you never miss an episode.
And as I always say, if you found value in today's conversation, and I have no idea how you couldn't find value, so I know you found value, please take a moment to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. It helps other clinicians find this podcast and join the movement.
And until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and keep scaling up your practice. This podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. The content shared in this podcast should never be used as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the guidance of a qualified healthcare professional with any questions you may have regarding your health or a medical condition. The information and treatment discussed in this podcast are based on Canadian guidelines and approved practices as of the time of recording. If you are listening from outside of Canada, please consult your local healthcare professional to ensure compliance with your region's medical standards, guidelines, and recommendations. The creators of this podcast disclaim all liability for any decisions or actions taken based on the content discussed. Listening to this podcast does not establish a professional or patient-client relationship.